This book is the most remarkable piece of literature this world has ever seen. The Bible has outsold every other publication, been translated into more languages than any other. Some people were so committed to the concept of this being God's book that they were even willing to die for that proposition. At the hands of Nero, they were fed to the lions, or they were burned at the stake by Bloody Mary, Queen of England. Others used this same book as a justification for crusades that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. This is the story of how the Bible survived from the time of Moses until it reached the shores of America on the Mayflower.
After the death of Wycliffe, the people who had followed him considered themselves to be operating independent of the Roman Church. They, for example, believed in the priesthood of all believers, and they believed it was only proper that they would be allowed to administer the sacraments without the authority of a bishop. Besides that, there was a tremendous contrast between the Wycliffites and the Roman priests. The Wycliffite followers were poor people. The Roman priests had an opulence that made them obviously contrasting. When the Wycliffites went out to preach, they preached in the vernacular of people, but a Roman priest conducted services in the dead language of Latin, and that gave the Wycliffites a tremendous success publicly. They were such an enormous success that one of the critics said that if you were to meet two men walking down the streets, one of them would be a Wycliffite. And that gave them tremendous courage. Courage so that they placarded slogans and insults in all the public places. In fact, in 1395, they made a request of Parliament that they would abolish celibacy and transubstantiation and prayers for the dead and offerings unto images. In fact, they took the booklet that was written by Wycliffe on the 12 Conclusions, and they nailed it in such public places as St. Paul's Cathedral and to this place behind me, which is Westminster Abbey. This caused an uproar with the bishops and clergy. This was tantamount to blasphemy against the Church. In 1399, the Bishop of York aligned with King Henry VI. It was he who placed the crown on the head of this new king and stated to him at the coronation to consolidate the throne, conciliate the clergy, and sacrifice the Lollards. Lollards was an abusive term for Wycliffe's followers, meaning mumblers. Henry replied to the prelate, "I will be the protector of the Church." 2 years later, in 1401, the Act for Burning Heretics was passed by the Parliament, and the Bishop of York had accomplished his counter-Reformation objectives. It was only within 8 days of the passage of that bill that they started lighting the fires here at Smithfield, so they would burn to death those that they did not agree with. The first man that they picked him was a man by the name of William Sawtry. And William Sawtry had committed a crime. He was heard to say that he adored not the cross on which Christ died as much as the Christ who died upon the cross. And for that, they dragged him to the precincts of St. Paul's Cathedral. They shaved his head, they put on a layman's cap, and they degraded him. And then they handed him over to civil authorities so that he might have mercy extended to him. The mercy that was given by civil authorities was to bring him here to Smithfield, build a faggot of woods around his body and burn him until he was dead. And he was only the first in a large, noble army of Wycliffites that died for their faith.
The quality of these persecuted people is exemplified by Lord Cobham. He became a disciple to Wycliffe's theology. He was brought to trial at St. Paul's on September the 23rd in 1413. When he was questioned and the shouting priest demanded that he believe, he responded, "I'm willing to believe all that God desires, but that the Pope should have authority to teach what is contrary to the Scripture, that I can never believe." He was led back to the Tower of London.
They immediately brought him back to his prison, and they gave him 40 days before his intended execution. During that 40 days, they hoped that he would recant, and his recantation would weaken the cause of the Wycliffe followers. But something amazing happened that I cannot explain. His prison was the Tower of London here behind me, and the night before his intended execution, he escaped from there. To my knowledge, nobody else has ever done that in history. And from there he went to Wales. And he was gone for a considerable period of time until December of 1417, when he was recaptured. And then he was brought back to the area and taken to St. Giles Field. And there they chained him to a rotisserie. And they turned him around like they would roast a hog. And before a slow burning fire, they roasted him to death. What you are looking at is the Lollards Tower. It is attached to Lambeth Palace, which is the City of London residence for the Archbishop of Canterbury. I'd like to tell you the story of the building of that tower. A little room on the very top of it was added, which is known as the Lollards Prison. It's only 12 by 12 with a 7-foot ceiling. It has old rusty iron rings that are still attached to the wall, and where some of those prisoners, after they had been tortured, were held in chains until they were brought out to die, they left etchings on the wall. One of those etchings says, "Jesus amor meus." It means that Jesus is my love. It is impossible to stand in that little room without honestly being moved to tears. The second emotional result of the constitutions of Arundel happened in the city of Norwich. There were so many of Wycliffe's followers who were publicly executed for their faith that the place of public execution to this day is known as the Lollard Pit. That's because so many Lollards died there. Now these Lollards were being burned to death all over the country. That just shows you the excessive, unbelievable number of people who were the followers of Wycliffe and who were willing to live for their faith until they died by burning. Few crusades in human history have met with the overwhelming success that attended the followers of Wycliffe. 125 years later, they were as numerous and as active as they had been at the time when Wycliffe was living. And at that time, they started a reformation that literally turned Europe upside down. Nothing better illustrates the Renaissance than the sculpture by Bernini in the Piazza Navona. If I were to try and define the Middle Ages politically, I would have to begin at the fall of Rome and end at the discovery of America in 1492. If I were to try and define it religiously, I would begin at the conversion of Constantine and end at the publication of a Greek New Testament. But no matter how I try to define the edges of it, one thing is important. I must make a distinction in the middle. There is a difference between the Dark Ages and the Renaissance, and that came about in 3 stages.
When Charlemagne became the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD, He gradually established schools for training priests and monks. He ordered manuscripts of books, especially the Bible, to be copied with extreme care. The church became the guardians of education. The movement flourished from the 11th to the 14th century and became known as scholasticism. The second stage focused attention on human achievement. It was the age of inner-motivated men who emphasized human values and rational thought. This philosophy of life continued through the 16th century. The third stage that contributed to the Renaissance came in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople.
Thank you very much. It was only 3 years after the fall of Constantinople that the first Bible was printed here in the city of Mainz. It happened on August the 15th in 1456. And the man that was responsible for bringing it to us was a man named Johann Gutenberg. I'm sitting in a little outside cafeteria with a market behind me and the Cathedral of Mainz in the background, and around the corner from me is the Gutenberg Museum. Johann Gutenberg didn't take his name from his father. He actually took it from the place where his mother was born. But his story is a story of vision and of failure. It's a fascinating and it's a very sad story. It happens that the last of his Bibles that were sold was sold in New York City for $5.5 million. And yet the story of his life is of vision and frustration, with millions in the bank, but not the 25 cents he needed for the taxi cab to get there and pick it up.
As a boy, he entertained himself in his father's workshop by carving the separate letters of his name on soft wood. He placed them on his father's table when the H fell into a bucket of purple dye. He quickly retrieved it, and he let it rest to dry on a piece of paper. The impression it left on the paper and in his mind was indelible. This was where the concept of a printing press with movable type was born. It took some 40 years for the press to move from an idea to a reality. Building a press was expensive and required money, and it was money that he did not have. About 1450, a lawyer by the name of Johann Faust invested in Gutenberg's new enterprise. When Gutenberg ran into financial difficulties, Faust took legal proceedings against him, apparently won the case, and moved the press and tools to his own house in Mainz. There, with the assistance of Peter Schoeffer, they published various books. It is not known if the Bible had been printed previous to this court case. If it had, all its proceeds would have undoubtedly gone to Faust.
He died in 1468, and he was destitute and he was forgotten. He was buried in a little Franciscan church here, but that church was demolished and another one was built in its place. And that one was demolished, and you can't find his grave today. And it's very sad, because you take one page of human history, and a man that made such a significant contribution to it is almost out of the picture altogether. A man that created a machine that literally became a guillotine to ignorance in the Middle Ages. And he's gone, and he's forgotten. You know, 30 years after his death, his machines were seen in all the major cities all over Europe. You could go anywhere from Rome to Barcelona and you could find his machines. In the city of Venice, for example, there were 151 printing shops. If you were to go to Wittenberg, there's a man there that lived by the name of Luft, and before he died, he printed 100,000 Bibles. There's a man by the name of William Caxton who came over here to the continent on business, and while he was in the city of Cologne, he was exposed to the printing process. Fascinated him. When he went back to England, he took a printing press with him and he set it up in Westminster. He only produced 96 separate works with 18,000 pages, but he left something that caused the future reformers to dream a dream, and their dream became a reality.
During this rebirth of knowledge that came to be known as the Renaissance, Greek became the important language of the humanists of that day. In October 26, 1467, a child came into the world who was to become the greatest humanist of his day.
His father, who was a monk, called him Erasmus. His brother Peter and he were both illegitimate children, though his mother and his father married later in life. He was 8 years of age before he got an opportunity for education. He went to the School of the Brethren of the Common Life in a city called Deventer. And he made some important friends there, one of which was to become the future Pope.
When he was 11 years of age, both his mother and father died of the plague. He eventually became a boarder at an Augustine monastery, and on April the 25th in 1492, he became an Augustinian monk. He had a gift of writing poetry, but to augment his income, he started learning and teaching Greek. He was invited to become a student of Greek at Oxford. He was welcomed by the intelligentsia, and he met a 19-year-old boy whose name was Thomas More, the future Chancellor of England. They were to become lifelong friends. More took him to the royal nursery to meet a 9-year-old Henry, who was the future King of England known as Henry VIII. On every occasion, he dazzled and amazed his friends with his sharp mind and his keen wit. His friendships were eventually influential everywhere, even with the Pope in Rome.
There's no question, but there is a missing factor in the story. This man became so popular. What was it that created his popularity? Unquestionably, it was his pain. And that's what brings me here to the city of Brussels. And I'm here because this is a house in which he lived that had been built back in the middle of the 15th century out of Flemish brick. And he's not the only notable person that lived here, because a friend of his that later became the Pope in Rome also lived in this house. And today it's a museum. And this museum is the largest single collection of his writings that we can find in any single place in the world today. What writings? You remember we talked previously about the poems that were written in the 1490s. And then that gave way to the Manual of the Christian Soldier. In that work, he didn't mean to condemn the church. He just wanted to point out to them that the dogma and the ritual of the church was irrelevant to the day in which he lived. And it was the first kind of writing by a notable person that had been done. And oh, what a reaction it brought. You see, all the men that were hungry for the Reformation immediately caught on to it. So much so that William Tyndale, for example, translated it into English, had it printed, and then circulated at his own expense. Then, you remember in 1505, he's living in the home of Sir Thomas More in London, and he writes his In Praise of Folly. It was his analysis of the church of his day. He believed that they were simply servants or slaves, if you would, to folly itself. And that included kings and bishops and princes and even popes. That's the reason for which, when you look at some of this literature here, you'll see sections of it inked out, crossed over. The people that belonged to the Church of Rome in his day were very concerned about what he was doing, believing that he was actually feeding what would ultimately divide the church. And there's no question about it, it did divide the church. But that brought us down to the most significant work that he wrote in his lifetime. The year is 1516. He started doing his translation of the Greek New Testament previously. He had finished it while he was a teacher at Queen's College in Cambridge, and that tower, named the Erasmus Tower, is dedicated to him because that's the place where he terminated his translating work. Then he put it together on a page, for example, divided in two. On one half he put the Greek text, and on the other half he put his Latin translations. And then he dedicated the entire work to Pope Leo X. That kind of secured for him at least the outward favor of the church and promised him that he'd be able to sell the product. Unfortunately, it was banned in most countries almost immediately. But you see what happened? It just fell like seed on the ground. There's no other way to describe it, because Martin Luther got a look at it and then decided he could translate that Greek into the German of his day, and he gave the Germans a Bible. That's exactly the thing that Zwingli and Calvin did for the people that lived in Switzerland. That's exactly the same thing that William Tyndale did for the people that lived in England. And then it went through editions. It was the 4th and 5th edition, according to Philip Schaff, the church historian, that became the Textus Receptus. And if you're not familiar with that term, that's the document that the translators of the King James Version of the Bible in 1611 used to do their translation from. No, before I conclude, I've got to admit, Erasmus did not intend to split the church. As far as he was concerned, the conflagration that came was not coming with his purpose or intent, but he was standing in the dry timber, and he was playing with matches. He himself admitted that he laid the egg, and Luther hatched it.
One man stands above all others when you talk about the Protestant Reformation: Martin Luther. He was the very center of this religious cleavage with the Church of Rome, but he was also to play a vital role in the story of the Bible. Martin Luther was born on November the 10th in 1483. He entered the Augustinian monastery and had already earned his B.A. and his M.A. A year later, he took his vows to become a monk. In 1511, he was transferred to the monastery at Wittenberg and became a professor of biblical literature. A priest by the name of John Tetzel was selling indulgences. Indulgences were a form of penance by price, allowing people to purchase a piece of paper which afforded them the right to commit sins, the degree of which was determined by the price they paid. Luther strongly resented the practice. At the same time, he was lecturing on the book of Romans. He discovered the verse in Romans 1:17. He concluded that a man in Christ, through faith, may have the righteousness of God transferred to his credit. There was no need of indulgences or other forms of penance. This became his great conversion experience. It was the combination of these things which led to the famous 95 Theses, which were nailed to the castle church door at Wittenberg in 1517. In these theses, he severely attacked the church. He took issue with every doctrine that was not founded on the Scriptures. In 1520, Pope Leo X issued a bull requiring him to recant under the threat of excommunication. In 1521, at an assembly at Worms, he gave his immortal statement: "Here I stand, my conscience is captive to the Word of God." This is the actual location of this landmark meeting. Then on December 10, 1521, he publicly burned the papal bull. His pen became very active. His publications attacked the doctrines of the Church that he felt were at odds with the Scripture.
I'm standing in a room where this man lived. He walked through this door. He stepped on these wooden boards. He warmed himself at that furnace. And there is no question about it, he needed friends, sacred and secular. And these writings accomplished that purpose. There were other treatises that were going to be written afterward, and the greatest of them was his theological contribution, which he titled The Bondage of the Will. He printed that in 1525. It was done in response to a vicious attack by the humanist Desiderius Erasmus.
That same year, when he was 42 years of age, there was a peasants' revolt, and he had to write a denial of association. In fact, he wrote an inflammatory condemnation of the revolt. It was in the same year that he married Catherine von Bora.
I'm sitting amidst the furniture that Luther sat amidst. He sat on these chairs. He sat by this table. If any guests were in his house, it was from this table that he led his evening devotions. And there's no question he was a reformer. A rebel is a person that tries to change the past. A reformer is a person that tries to change the future. And every religious reformer knows that you can't affect succeeding generations unless you provide them with a Bible in their own vernacular. That makes the years important for his pen, the years preceding September of 1522, when for the first time for Luther of printing presses in the German language came a New Testament.
His most important work was the translation of the German Bible. It was a translation from the Erasmus Greek New Testament. In its arrangement, Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation were placed at the end of the publication as non-canonical. He did not believe that they could claim the right of inspiration. Within the first 14 years of the completion of that Bible, it, or portions of it, went through 377 editions.
He taught the world how to protest against the evils of popes and potentates of that day. And not only protest, but make it permanent. And he did that by providing a Bible in the language that everybody understood.
Luther wasn't the only champion of the European Reformation. Ulrich Zwingli was responsible for translating the Zurich Bible for the people of Switzerland. If Lutheranism was born in Wittenberg, then Presbyterianism was born in Geneva. John Calvin was the most notable pioneer of this reform. He was without parallel in the area of theology. The other reformers wrote and argued doctrine, but not to the measure and depth characteristic of Calvin. He also built the only university for the training of Reformed ministers and made Geneva the capital city of the Reformed movement. Calvin ruled Geneva with an iron fist. Now the Protestants took their turn at persecuting. 58 executions occurred. In fact, 34 women were burned on a suspicion of spreading the plague by magical means. Geneva became the Rome of Protestantism for some 6,000 refugees from England, Scotland, and France.
I'm sitting here on a bridge that goes over the River Calm in Cambridge. And I'm thinking about some great rivers of which we're not sure where the source is. And as it is with rivers, it is certainly true of great movements. There's no question when you talk about the Reformation and you think of Germany, you automatically think of Martin Luther. In Switzerland, it's Ulrich Zwingli or John Calvin. In Scotland, it's John Knox. But in England, the source of that movement was really the Indestructible Book. There's no question in our mind that there were certain personalities that helped it along, striding in its progress. And if we try to find the initiator of those personalities, it's probably a little man by the name of Thomas Bilney.
Bilney was born in the city of Norwich around 1495. He was a student at Trinity Hall in Cambridge, majoring in the field of canon law. Two factors left an uneasy balance in Bilney's life. First, Bilney's religious life was barren and non-productive. Fastings, vigils, and indulgences had left him with empty pockets, empty health, and an empty heart. Secondly, the Erasmus Greek New Testament had crossed his path. Published the previous year, it had survived the blacklist ban placed on it and was known to be in the religious subculture of Cambridge. One night he went out and he bought a black market copy of that Erasmus Greek New Testament. He came to the words of Paul in 1 Timothy 1:15, which stated that Christ came to this world to save sinners, and he admitted that he was the worst. Those words shot through his heart. On the spot he trusted in the Christ of those pages. Doubt gave way to assurance, and an effervescent joy dominated his heart. He had to share his newfound faith with others. He picked the White Horse Inn for the field in which to sow his seed. It was a pub where the academic superiors of Cambridge assembled and discussed subjects prohibited in the classroom. It was nicknamed Little Germany because it discussed so much of Luther's writings. Bilney brought his New Testament to their discussion tables. The result was cataclysmic. The news spread through Cambridge and began to attract notable lecturers from the university. But these men were being converted by their exposure to Bilney's New Testament. This small group of men was eventually to produce 2 archbishops and 8 martyrs. But among these notable academicians was a young man by the name of William Tyndale. Tyndale was no ordinary student. Born in 1494, we know that he graduated with his master's in 1515 from Magdalen Hall in Oxford. At this time, Thomas Wolsey, the Archbishop of York, was waging an all-out assault on the reformers. In fact, in 1517, at Little Park in Coventry, 5 men and 2 women were tried for heresy. The charge was that they were teaching their children the Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments in English. They were found guilty and burned to death in the public square. Wolsey was also relentless in his search for forbidden books at Oxford. The influence of the Lollards was still strongly felt in Oxford, and Wolsey sought to destroy every forbidden book that he could get his hand on. When Tyndale heard about Bilney's White Horse Inn fellowship in 1519, he left Oxford for the more tolerant Cambridge and became associated with this secretive Bible study group.
It was here in Cambridge that Tyndale discovered the spellbinding and regenerating power of the Bible. He knew that the revival was confined to Cambridge only because of its culture. And if the ordinary man cannot rise to the culture of Cambridge, then the Bible must step down to the level of ordinary understanding. Thus, the task of his life and the cause of his death was to translate the Bible into the language of the common man.
He was an excellent Greek scholar, and he was also a great debater of the Scriptures. A certain clergyman taunted Tyndale by saying, "We were better to be without God's law than the Pope's." Tyndale fired back, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spares my life ere many years, I will cause the boy that drives the plow to know more about the Scriptures than you." At the age of 30, he decided that the mission of his life would be to translate the Bible into English. He may have never realized that this project would eventually earn him the title, the Father of the English Bible. He became employed by the John Walsh family at Little Sodbury Manor in the Cotswolds Hills near Bristol, the area from which he came. He became the chaplain of Sir John Walsh and his wife, and the tutor of their 2 children. And it was in this home where he started the assignment of translating the Greek into English. This little attic room happens to be the private room of William Tyndale while he worked for the Walsh family. Here he slept, and here he kept his books, and here he studied. The idea came to him that if the Greek New Testament had such a profound effect upon the scholastic world, what would an English Bible do for plowboys? At this very spot, he decided he was going to translate the Greek New Testament into English. He appealed to the Bishop of London, Cuthbert Tunstall, to rescind the law passed against the Lollards, forbidding any use of Scripture other than in Latin. But it was futile. Tyndale therefore determined to exile himself from his native land, and he set sail for the continent to accomplish his great mission. Tyndale traveled to Wittenberg to finish the translation of the New Testament. Luther and Tyndale were strongly united by the same motto, Sola Scriptura, only the Scriptures. The city became a refuge for the outlaw. The printing was the most difficult task of all. In Cologne, they found a willing printer. English spies broke up the operation, coming through the front door while Tyndale escaped through the back with whatever copies were finished. It was a narrow escape. They then traveled to Worms, where they found another willing printer. In December 1525, they accomplished the task, and the New Testaments were ready for shipping. He had made good friends with the London port authorities, and they determined the best way to smuggle this forbidden book into the country was by placing them in sacks of flour that were being imported into England. Thousands of Tyndale's Bibles were reaching the shore of England, and the words of the English translation were fermenting a national unrest. Today you can see a statue of Tyndale that overlooks the port where his Bibles reached England. The opposition which came to the Reformed movement in England came from the established church, from the crown, and from humanism. The religious opposition was expected, as the two forces were antagonistic in every respect. The established church came to be caricatured in the person of Thomas Wolsey, the last Roman Catholic prelate to rule over England. His power and wealth was graphically illustrated by the incredible home which he built for himself called Hampton Court. It was even larger than the royal residence.
He was a devout Roman Catholic, and he was sold out lock, stock, and barrel for the advancement of that church in this country. To that end, he became the leader of a crusade to stamp out heretics, and that caused good and godly men to lose their property, to languish in prison, and some of them even to burn at a stake.
In the meantime, Henry VIII was the other voice of opposition to the Reformers. He was strongly opposed to the Lollards and the cause of the Reformation. In fact, the Pope had declared him the protector of the Church. Sir Thomas More became the third voice of opposition. More was an ideal Catholic. He submitted to fasts and vigils, scourged himself every Friday. He would sleep on the bare ground using a log for a pillow. He eventually became the Chancellor of England, the first layman ever to hold this powerful office. He strongly denounced Tyndale's doctrine, especially his English Bible. More determined that Tyndale must be assassinated. In 1528, Bishop Tunstall licensed More to refute the works of Tyndale in what became known as the Pen and Ink Wars. Tyndale's New Testament was having such an impact on the nation that the king condemned them to public burning at St. Paul's Cross, harassed and persecuted all found guilty of possessing or distributing them, and even raised money to buy out Tyndale's operation.
It was Tunstall who authorized Augustine Packington, a merchantman that did a lot of trade in Antwerp, to go over to the continent, buy every Bible available to be bought, bring it back here to St. Paul's Cathedral, and have it publicly burned. What Tunstall didn't know was that Packington was a friend of William Tyndale's, and he paid him 4 times the cost of production for every Bible he bought, which means that for every Bible that they burned here at St. Paul's, he paid to have it replaced and then added 3 more to Tyndale's arsenal.
Tyndale's Bible was just the tool that the pioneer reformers needed. Bilney, who was the initiator of this revolution, undoubtedly relied on this precious book. But in 1527, he was arrested while preaching in Ipswich.
They put him in a cell in the Tower of London, but they left the door open, and they played a cat-and-a-mouse game with him. They let his friends come in and out to try and dissuade him from becoming a martyr, and they succeeded. On December the 7th in 1527, he signed an abjuration, and the following day was a Sunday. They walked him that morning through public thoroughfare all the way from the Tower of London to St. Paul's Cathedral. When he got here, he listened to a sermon that denounced his heresy, and at this very location, they had a stack of William Tyndale's Bibles, and it was his job to ignite the Bibles and burn them. That event shattered his soul. It demented his spirit. He made his mind up that he was going to get arrested again. And in Norwich, in 1531, he accomplished that. Though he was tried in London, he was sentenced to be executed here in the city of Norwich, because this was the place where he held his greatest influence. And he spent his last night on earth, on August the 8th, 1531, in this damp, dark cell that was built in 1407. They had a table spread where he was sitting eating his last meal, just on the other side of that pillar. Five of his friends came to visit him to try and comfort and console him. They were led by Matthew Parker, who was later to become the Archbishop of Canterbury under the reign of Elizabeth I. They came down that spiral, narrow staircase. They filed over to the end of the table where he was eating his meal, and they gave him words to try and fortify him. He didn't need fortification. He was totally committed to die for Christ. Had they offered him a pardon, it would only have disappointed him. The more they spoke about the flames being cooled by the Spirit of God, quietly he finished his meal. When he had completed, he pushed the plate apart, got a finger on his Bible, and pulled it down the table to where they were sitting. And in their dumb silence, unexplained, he simply rested his elbow on the table, put his index finger out and held it over the open flame of a candle. And he held it there until it burned his finger to the bone. As they watched in silence, he pointed toward the open Bible on the table beside him and read the reference he'd just been reading before in Isaiah 43, verse 2. When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned. He commented that to burn for any other reason than dying for Christ would burn. But with Christ in the flames, they don't burn. And it was in that frame of mind he spent his last night in this cell.
As they took him from the cell, they crossed the Bishop's Bridge, and he ran to embrace the stake and thank God for the privilege of having a second opportunity to die for Christ. He was a noble example for his contemporaries. First, he taught the reformers how to live for Christ, and then he taught them how to die for him. When men were beheaded, usually gentlemen, it was normally done at Tower Hill. When they were hanged, usually common people, it was done at Tyburn. And when they were burned, those guilty of religious crimes, it was done at Smithfield.
A statue should be erected to the noble men and women that burned to death here at Smithfield. They were all courageous, but some of them exemplified uncommon valor. They were human. That must be remembered. They were as human as you are, as I am. Their bodies were subject to pain. Their bones were as brittle as ours. They floated on waves of emotion. Sometimes it took them up to ecstatic heights, and sometimes it dropped them down to the deepest valleys of despair. Some of them were not taken against their will. They consented to their ordeal. They did so because they had convictions that went like shafts of steel into their soul, and it wouldn't let them bend to pressure. Or some of them were weak, and they recanted. But then they found the courage to refortify themselves and turn around and face the ordeal all over again. Some of them were strong, burly, stout men. Some of them were weak, fragile, sensitive women. But all of them were heroes.
The cause of the Reformation and the story of the English Bible hold a great debt of gratitude, ironically, to the carnal passions of King Henry VIII. His first marriage with Catherine of Aragon had produced 6 children, but only one girl survived infancy, the future Bloody Mary. King Henry blamed Catherine for the failure to provide him a son. Then her fate was sealed when the king cast his eyes on a young woman by the name of Anne Boleyn.
She had an oval face, bright eyes, black hair. She walked with dignity. It said that she had a sweet singing voice, and she danced elegantly. Whenever the king was despondent, it was always her songs and her laughter that cheered him up and attracted him like a magnet. He wrote letters to her, but most of them were in French. In them he admitted that he had a deep love for her, but she had no intention of becoming his mistress. When he saw the resolute of her morals, he then proposed marriage to her. But his divorce had not yet been complete, so she declined. When he appealed to her father to help him in the proposal, the father encouraged her, and she decided that if he would ever get a divorce, she would become his wife. It must be realized that a divorce from Catherine, followed by a Protestant queen, was tantamount to a break with Rome. Cardinal Wolsey could see the writing on the wall. He was unable to convince the king that he shouldn't seek the divorce, and equally unable to convince him that he shouldn't marry Anne. And he knew as inevitable as the fall of gravity that it would mean his fall from grace. One historian put it, and I think put it well. He said 1,000 Wolsleys was not worth one Anne Boleyn.
When the Pope, for various political reasons, did not grant the divorce, Wolsey saw that he had lost his influence, and the king replaced Wolsey with Sir Thomas More. The king, upset that the church would not grant him a divorce from Catherine, made a monumental decision that was to sever its relationship with Rome. In 1534, Parliament passed an act denoting the king to be the sole and supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Sir Thomas More could not subscribe to this decision. He was arrested and put in the Tower. He spent 1 year there and refused to recant. For this he became known as the Man for All Seasons. He was placed on trial for high treason, and 7 days later was executed outside the Tower. A man by the name of Thomas Cranmer was to play a significant role in the continuing story of the indestructible book. In 1533, he had been consecrated as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He defended the king's decision. It was he that declared the marriage to Catherine null and void. On June the 1st, 1535, Cranmer crowned Anne Boleyn as queen and became the godfather of their daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth. When Tyndale's New Testaments had reached the shores of England, there were many in the church, and one on the throne that thought the only way to stop him was to have him burned. Bounty hunters from England were traveling all over the continent, wearing disguises and paying for information, but all without success. He began the translation of the Old Testament. He eventually moved to Antwerp. Even though the king had severed from the Catholic Church, he was still very much opposed to Tyndale.
Tyndale soon learned what it was like to be the fox out in the country, surrounded by the hound. It didn't take him long to learn how to live like a fugitive and to wander like a vagabond from city to city, like this German city behind me, and sometimes cross over the boundaries into other countries. He wore many different disguises, and what made him particularly difficult to locate was the fact that he spoke 7 languages with such fluency that you couldn't determine which one was his native tongue. And I deeply and sincerely feel for the man, though he's in a page of history. I do so because I know that he must have lived with fears and with trepidation that was part of his life, day after day, if not hour after hour.
In 1535, while he was in Antwerp, Henry Phillips, posing as a friend, betrayed the identity of the reformer. He was captured, taken into custody, and imprisoned in the impregnable Vilvoorde Castle near Brussels in Belgium. He was found guilty of sacrilege, but it was not until Friday, October the 6th in 1536 that they brought him out to exact his capital punishment. This monument commemorates that historic event.
It was not until Friday, October 6th in 1536 that they brought him from his cell to the place of public execution. There was no reticence, there was no regret, there was no hesitation. When they brought him to the stake against which he was going to be chained and burned to death, he noticed that it had one unique feature about it. There were 2 holes in the stake through which a piece of wire was to be threaded that went around his neck, because according to the court, he had to be strangled at the same time that he was going to be burned. And when the executioner was putting the wire through the hole and marking it around his throat, he made his last recorded public statement. And his statement was in the form of a prayer. Lord, open the King of England's eyes.
They strangled his voice, they burned his hand, they ravaged and destroyed his property, burning every Bible they could find. Though only one of his first edition New Testaments has survived the biblical Holocaust, his commitment inspired thousands, his priorities gave guidance to the movement, and his translation influenced every succeeding one, until 90% of his work filtered unchanged into the best-selling book of all time, the King James Version of 1611.
This book is the most remarkable piece of literature this world has ever seen. The Bible has outsold every other publication, been translated into more languages than any other. Some people were so committed to the concept of this being God's book that they were even willing to die for that proposition. At the hands of Nero, they were fed to the lions, or they were burned at the stake by Bloody Mary, Queen of England. Others used this same book as a justification for crusades that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. This is the story of how the Bible survived from the time of Moses until it reached the shores of America on the Mayflower.
After the death of Tyndale, the English Bible was considered a forbidden book. It would take a combination of political maneuvers to clear the way for an authorized English Bible. King Henry VIII was never a Protestant at heart. It was all an issue of political expediency. However, his new queen, Anne Boleyn, was a devoted believer in the Reformed movement. Her views were not covered in secrecy. She made efforts to exert influence on Secretary Cromwell to overlook the crimes of some caught smuggling Tyndale's New Testaments into England. In fact, she cordially received a specially bound copy of such a New Testament, sent to her while Tyndale was a prisoner at Bilboa, and today it is preserved in the British Museum. She appointed Matthew Parker, a noted reformer, to become chaplain to her daughter Elizabeth. Finally, Anne promoted another worthy reformer named Hugh Latimer to become the king's chaplain. It seemed that the Reformation had finally established a firm foundation that they could build upon. But the passions of the king turned once again desire toward another lady at the court, Jane Seymour. These circumstances so troubled Anne that she gave premature birth to a stillborn son. One day in January of 1536, she walked into a room and unexpectedly found them in a compromising position. She had expected something to happen, but what and when?
A festival had been arranged in the city of Greenwich on May the 1st, 1536. It was going to be a gala occasion. The bleachers were filled with people waiting on joisters to entertain them. The king and queen was present. The queen accidentally dropped a handkerchief, and a man by the name of Henry Norris, one of the chief joisters, picked it up and he wiped his brow with it. The king took the occasion to leave the place in a rage. It was quite obvious that he was very disturbed, and that only caused anxiety with the queen. She didn't know what it was that disturbed him. She tried to find out, but without success. It wasn't until the next morning, when she saw Kingston, the lieutenant of the Tower, that she put the pieces together and realized what was happening and let out a scream. They brought her down on a barge from the River Thames to the Traitor's Gate in the entrance into the Tower, and they made her occupy the same suite of rooms that she did during the coronation ceremonies.
When Archbishop Cranmer heard of her arrest, he was stunned. He could not accept the charges brought against her. 3 gentlemen, including the young man who picked up her handkerchief, were interrogated, accused of acts of adultery with the Queen. Each in turn strongly denied the charges, but when one was put on the body rack, he quickly agreed to any statements they wished. They were all sentenced to death, including the Queen.
It was 11 o'clock in the morning on May the 19th that Anne quietly left her rooms, went into the courtyard of the Tower behind me, put her head on a block of wood. It was a Frenchman that performed the ceremonies, he with his attendants, and as he had promised her, he severed her head with one blow of the axe. A cannon was shot from the Tower to notify the king, who had been hunting in ground somewhere in the vicinity, to let him know that she was dead. It was November of 1527 when Bilney was arrested, and at his trial in London, the metaphorical closet doors opened and the skeletons fell out. The first problem that he faced was caused by a man named Thomas Garrett. He was found black marketing 350 Bibles here into Cambridge, and that put all of Bilney's friends under suspicion. In fact, it led to their arrest. That only compounded difficulties for John Frith, because in Oxford, a man by the name of John Clark was found reading his Bible in his own bedroom to several other students. That led to the arrest and suspicion of all the other friends of Bilney that were in Oxford. And among the students that were arrested was John Frith.
The group were imprisoned in a cave beneath the college. Within 7 months, 4 of them had died because of the deplorable conditions. When they were released, they were commanded to carry faggots to the top of Carfax and burn a collection of forbidden books. Frith managed to escape this punishment and cross the English Channel to Antwerp. There he met Tyndale, and a close bond of friendship developed between them. While he was away from England, he wrote and published numerous manuscripts and demonstrated forceful logic, his knowledge of the Scripture, and his forthright attacks on Roman doctrines were unanswerable. We're never told why, but Wright crossed the Channel back to England and was eventually taken to the Tower. Two other secret reformers, Cromwell and Cranmer, held him as a prisoner of the Crown. It secured certain privileges and liberties. During this time, Wright conducted a debate from his cell through the printing presses with no less an enemy of the Reformation as Sir Thomas More, the Chancellor of England.
Refusing many opportunities and encouragements to escape, he was taken to St. Paul's Cathedral on June the 20th, 1533. He was tried, he was condemned, and he was relocated at the infamous Newgate prison, which is just behind me. It was while he was in the prison that he met a 24-year-old tailor by the name of Andrew Hewitt, and the two men, sentenced to the same punishment for the same crimes, became close friends. And on the 4th of July, 1533, they brought the two of them here to Smithfield. They chained them back to back with the stake between them, and they died. He had only just turned 30 years of age, and the spirit and body of John Wright parted company here in Smithfield.
Smithfield was to claim many more men and women who were devoted to the Reformation and their love for the English Bible. John Nicholson, referred to as Lambert, was put on trial for his doctrinal differences of the Lord's table. On November 16th, in 1538, he was tried and convicted at Westminster Hall. 4 days later, he was burned at Smithfield. The winds were contrary. The fire was kept low, burning the lower legs to stubs. He had to hang to the chains. Soldiers became impatient and thrust lengthy spears into his side. By this time the hands were on fire. He held them out towards the people, and he shouted, "None but Christ, none but Christ." Although Tyndale had never finished the translation of the Old Testament, John Rogers picked up his pen and, using the alias of Thomas Matthews, finished the work. Then he sent the documents to a printer in England. The printer was so impressed with the work that he sent them to Archbishop Cranmer to see if he could get official approval. The Archbishop indirectly presented these documents to King Henry, and miraculously, he gave official approval for an English Bible to be printed in England for the very first time. With the exception of part of the Old Testament, this was really Tyndale's translation of the Bible. In fact, at the end of the book of Malachi, William Tyndale's initials are proudly displayed. This was only 3 years after Tyndale's final prayer, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." The footnotes in the Matthews Bible were strongly anti-Catholic, and this did not help foreign relations. Cromwell, the Secretary of State, decided that another Bible must be printed. Miles Coverdale softened the footnotes from the previous Bible, and in 1539 the Great Bible was finished. The Great Bible was but an edition of Tyndale's outlawed translation. Here it was on the streets, with absolute freedom, dressed in a new suit. A royal declaration was made. It was to be bought by every parish church in the land, and a time limit was given for the purchase. Once the time passed, the price doubled every month, until every church in England possessed a copy of the English Bible. It must be kept within access of the public at any hour the public wished to read it. The church was also to provide a reader for those who were unable to read. The Bible was not a gift to the public by the church, but by the king. King Henry was central, and on either side of him stood Cranmer and Cromwell, by whom it was to be distributed through the priests to the people. This became the English Bible for the next 20 years. Though Tyndale's ashes lay scattered in a foreign land without even a burial, if anything, this Bible should be his tombstone. The great Bible was in every respect the fruit of his labor and the memorial of his life. Henry VIII was the husband of 6 wives, the lover of several concubines, and the father of many illegitimate children. Only 3 legitimate children survived infancy: Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward. In 1546, Edward automatically became the heir of the throne at 9 years of age. The prevailing influence of his life was the Reformed faith. He was Protestant to the core, and the cause of the Reformers seemed firmly established. However, his health was poor, and after only 6 years on the throne, he died. The male line finished. The eldest daughter, Mary, inherited the throne.
She was as committed to the Catholic faith as her stepbrother had been to the Protestant faith. She believed that it was her right to conduct the Mass in her own private chapel, and if anybody made an issue of that, she appealed to her cousin, Charles V, and Charles V threatened to go to war on the issue of her religious freedom. She was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, and her mind was crowded with the events of misfortune that befell her mother in her childhood. Because her mother's marriage was considered illegal, she was considered a bastard child, and at times she was required to be a lady-in-waiting to her younger half-sister Elizabeth. She was 20 years of age when her mother died, but they wouldn't allow her into the room to see her mother. They wouldn't give her a moment of quietness to be able to say goodbye to her mother. Her life was filled with harassment, and even with the threat of murder.
Mary displayed a gentle disposition at the beginning of her reign, but attitudes and pressures changed. Mary's religious zeal soon became evident, and a dark cloud fell on the Reformers' cause in England. She vowed vengeance on Archbishop Cranmer, who approved the divorce of her mother to Henry VIII, making her illegitimate, and changed England to a Protestant faith. Cranmer, along with Nicholas Ridley, the Bishop of London, and Latimer, were all arrested. Reading of the Bible was again banned in England, and a migration of people of the Reformed faith filled the free cities of Europe. But John Rogers, a prebendary of St. Paul's, was obstinate. He preached at St. Paul's on the true doctrine taught in King Edward's days. He warned his congregation against any reversal to pestilent popery, as he called it. 10 days later, he was arrested.
Many of the people who were awaiting their execution here in the city of London were kept at the Tower of London. But many of them were kept on this site behind me, which today is Old Bailey, the chief criminal court in Britain, but in that day was the infamous Newgate prison. It was just 9 days before Thomas Hooper was executed in Gloucester. On the 4th of February, 1555, that a man by the name of John Rogers was kept here and was walked down that street to Smithfield to be burned to death. You may remember the name of John Rogers because he was also known by the alias of Thomas Matthews. He was an assistant to William Tyndale, and he's the man that produced the Matthews Bible. That was only 18 years before this event. When he was taken from this prison down to Smithfield, there was a large company of people waiting to see him, and among them his wife and his children. And he was the father of many children, but he wasn't allowed to say a word to one of them. 6 days later, he had to face a committee appointed by Cardinal Pole, and Gardiner condemned him to die. The reason for his condemnation was that he refused to accept the Christian character of the Church of Rome, and refused to accept that the elements of the Lord's Supper converted into the actual body and blood of Christ. It was February the 4th, 1555, when they brought him here to Smithfield to die by being burned to death. He was the first of 300 men who sacrificed their lives for that purpose during the reign of Bloody Mary. And Bradford, who was going to suffer the same judgment as he had, made a comment from his prison. He said he broke the ice valiantly. Nicholas Ridley, Bishop of London, and Hugh Latimer were probably the English Reformation's most famous martyrs. Ridley was Archbishop Cranmer's chaplain. He strongly supported Cranmer's Protestant position. His theology of the Eucharist influenced the Book of Common Prayer. Hugh Latimer started as a zealous Catholic, and it was Thomas Bilney at Cambridge that was crucial in the conversion of this extraordinary preacher. Bilney asked Latimer to hear his confession. For 2 hours in the confessional, Bilney confessed his love for the Scriptures and the comfort and confidence that they brought to his heart. Latimer was moved to tears and became a powerful preacher of Protestantism. He was arrested during the end of Henry's reign for his objections to Catholic theology. However, when Edward ascended the throne, he was released. It was 1553 when Bloody Mary came to the throne, and he was subpoenaed once again to appear before a tribunal at Westminster. He could have escaped this time and gone to the continent, but he decided not to. In 1554, he occupied a cell at the Tower of London, and 2 of his friends were in that cell with him, Ridley, the Bishop of London, and Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. They were then transferred here to the city of Oxford, and specifically to St. Mary's Church, where they were tried. Both Latimer and Ridley were interrogated about the elements of the Lord's Supper that opposed Catholic theology, but they stood firm. Ridley, entering the place of execution first, held up both hands toward heaven. When he saw Latimer with a cheerful look, he ran to him and embraced him, saying, "Be of good heart, brother, for God will either assuage the fury of the flames or else strengthen us to abide it." Then both of them went to the stake, and kneeling down, prayed with great fervor. After listening to a sermon that scathingly denounced them, they were chained to the stake and the timber was ignited. When the flames were coming up around him, the old man Latimer turned to his younger friend, and he said to him, "Master Ridley, play the man. We shall this day light a candle by God's grace in England that shall never be put out." The old man Latimer was 70 years of age when his lifeless body slumped over the chains above the dying embers. It was the indestructible book that changed his life. It comforted him in distress. He lived to preach it. And that same book changed all England.
Archbishop Cranmer was then ordered to stand trial. In 1556, he was degraded from office by a special Roman commission. It was designed to humiliate. His priestly tunic and stole were stripped from his body. A barber shaved his head. He'd been torturously worn down. The previous October, he had been forced to witness the horrific burnings of Latimer and Ridley. He finally faltered and wrote 5 recantations. Queen Mary and Cardinal Pole still maintained that he must be burned, but only after he made public declaration of his faith. It was raining on March the 21st, 1556, and they moved the formalities indoors to St. Mary's Church. Cole condemned his crimes and then called on Cranmer to make his public confession. But it wasn't until he reached the middle of his profession that he took a 180-degree turn. He said, "I renounce and refuse as things written with my hand contrary to the truth in my heart, and written for fear of death. And for as much as my hand offended in writing contrary to my heart, therefore my hand shall first be punished. For if I may come to the fire, it shall be first burned." As Cranmer went on to decry the Pope and the sacraments, Cole ordered Cranmer taken away. But they had a hard time keeping up with the old man, as he rushed himself to the stake. He bade his friends farewell, and the fire was kindled at his feet. Cranmer stretched out his right hand into the flame, and said, "This hand hath offended." Only once he withdrew it to wipe his face, and then he returned it until it burned to a stump. His last words were, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." He then collapsed and was consumed by the flame. 2 years later, and after 300 people had been burned to death, Bloody Mary died of poor health. On November the 17th, 1558, Elizabeth, her stepsister, ascended the throne. During her coronation, she was presented with the English Bible. She graciously received it, publicly kissed it, and promised to read it often. In 1559, she reenacted what her brother Edward VI had done before her, that one book of the whole Bible should be set up in every parish. While Bloody Mary was still on the throne, the reformers in Geneva employed their time by producing another translation of the Scriptures into English. It was completed in 1560 and was called the Geneva Bible. It was a unique Bible in that it was the first produced by a group or committee rather than by an individual. The group included John Knox, Miles Coverdale, William Withingham, and other lesser-known authorities. These men had access to John Calvin when they needed important input. Their source of material was greater than any afforded to a previous translator. They painstakingly worked on every minute detail. This method of translation was later adopted by the committees who worked on the King James Version. Though it was never sanctioned for public use in England, it quickly became the household Bible because of its convenient size. It was particularly the Puritans' Bible and became the Bible of the Commonwealth Army. In 1559, Elizabeth, now reigning queen, appointed Matthew Parker as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He was the master of Corpus Christi College in Cambridge. At his insistence, a New English Bible was needed. It has been called the fourth revision of the Tyndale translation. It was also the result of a committee, this time of 8 or 9 bishops. This became known as the Bishop's Bible.
His Bible was really needed, so he believed, because of the growing influence of the Geneva Bible. The Geneva Bible was actually causing 2 problems. In the first place, it was replacing the authority of the Authorized Version, which was the Great Bible in that day. In the second place, it was really undermining the authority of the bishops. Now, when Queen Elizabeth ascended the throne and the reformers came back from under the influence of John Calvin, a movement known as Puritanism began in England. That movement for Puritanism fostered another movement. That movement was toward nonconformity. Once they started stressing purity, and they were asking for purity in the lives of the clergy, that really focused on the bishops of that time. The end result of it was there was really an investigation to try and find a new form of church administration.
The movement alarmed Archbishop Parker because it threatened to undermine the respect that people would show to the clergy. He felt this new translation would re-establish their prestige. While they followed the Great Bible in the historical sections, the prophetical books carried the distinct influence of the Geneva Bible. It was costly and cumbersome. Its ecclesiastical terms were unsuited to the average man. The Bishop's Bible survived for 40 years and 20 editions. It was considered the weakest of all the Reformation Bibles. At the death of Elizabeth, a childless queen, James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, became the next heir to the throne of England. Unlike his mother, he was brought up with strong Protestant convictions. Scotland, reformed by John Knox, was Presbyterian to the core. So before he ever arrived in London, James was met by a party who presented him with the Millenary Petition.
This was a request signed by 800 Puritan clergymen, and they were asking the king to remove certain religious rituals, such as the signing of the cross at baptism. And that caused James II to call for an investigation into those things pretending to be amiss within the church. And the meeting was held here at Hampton Court in 1604.
On the third day of these meetings, Dr. John Reynolds, the leader of the Puritan group, argued that the existence of the Bishop's Bible was an acknowledgement to the inferiority of other translations when compared to the Geneva edition. His logic was invincible. Either make the Geneva the authorized version, or set about the task of creating a better translation. The latter suggestion appealed to the king's vanity. And so on July 22nd in 1604, the king announced the appointment of 54 men to work under the guidance of Richard Bancroft, the Bishop of London. It took another 3 years before the work was started, and there were 47 translators named. They were then divided between the 3 academic centres of England, Oxford, Cambridge, and Westminster, 2 committees meeting at each location. The books were divided, and each man made his own translation. He then passed it along to the other members of his group for approval. They then submitted their section, to each of the other 5 committees. When it had been amended, it was sent to the select committee of the best 12 scholars, and they agreed on the final revision. This was the greatest translation to date. It was the work of the greatest minds of that generation. The knowledge of Greek and Hebrew had greatly increased. And finally, Shakespeare, Spencer, Marlowe, and others had elevated literary taste through a new literary style. This book, therefore, was considered to be the greatest masterpiece of English literature, unparalleled by preceding or even succeeding generations. It was destined to become the best-selling book of all time. In 1580, a young man by the name of William Brewster was attending Peterhouse College in Cambridge. Though Brewster was unable to determine the goals of his academic pursuit, he was exposed to and adopted the doctrine of the Puritans. He was to play a crucial role in the founding of a brand new colony and eventually a nation. Brewster befriended another young man by the name of William Bradford. In 1602, they started walking 12 miles to Gainsborough to worship at the Separatist Church. The church had just called John Smythe, a Cambridge-educated man, as their pastor. This assembly considered themselves a separate and independent institution, accountable to none but its own congregation. For this stand they were persecuted by the state, and by 1606 Smythe the pastor and several of his congregation were obliged to flee into exile. They escaped to Amsterdam, where Smythe became a physician. During this time in history, Holland had a reputation for religious tolerance that attracted many persecuted religious groups. Brewster invited the members who remained to his manor in Scobie, England, and he became their spiritual advisor. Among those that joined this underground church was John Robinson. He was a minister from Norwich and had to flee from there for his own safety. This subjected Brewster's assembly to suspicion and persecution. Many members lost their property, paid heavy fines, and suffered stiff prison sentences. It soon became apparent that freedom of worship would necessitate their exile also.
I'm standing here by Fishtoft, about 4 or 5 miles from Boston, on marshy, soggy ground, where the Pilgrim Fathers met back in September of 1607. It wasn't a simple thing to migrate from England in those days. There was a law on the books known as Statute 13, Richard II, that made it illegal for a person to leave England without a permit. And what compounded the problem for these people was that on the 15th of that month, a warrant had been issued for the arrest of William Brewster, but the authorities were just not able to find him.
The group negotiated with a Dutch captain to meet them in the marshy waters at Fishtoft after the Puritans had loaded their goods and their families. Waiting for the tide to rise, they were surrounded by the sheriff's officials. The men were robbed, the women immodestly searched, and brought back to the city of Boston.
When they were brought into the city of Boston, the majority of them were detained in another area. But 7 of them that were considered ringleaders were brought here to the Guildhall, and they were kept in these 2 cells. There's a board or a bench that's against the wall at this side and at that side, and it's the same in the other cell. And the 7 men were kept in these quarters. A stairway beside me leads up into the courtroom where they were tried. I think they were very kindly treated. because John Cotton was the minister of the local church. And John Cotton's the name of the man that led a migration to the new land in 1630, only 10 years after the Pilgrim Fathers went. So the town people were sympathetic to the Pilgrims. They were kept here for 1 month. Then they were released to be taken to a tribunal in Lincoln, at which they were released on their own recognizance. But by the time that William Brewster arrived back at Scroby Manor, he had nothing left. He had lost everything in this venture.
We don't know how long they were imprisoned, but we do know that they made another attempt to migrate out of England. In 1608, they finally arrived in Amsterdam. Joining the group who had migrated before them, they now numbered about 100. All of them had left a farming life and were now forced to compete in a world of trade. They were plain folks, utterly honest, hard workers and conscientious to a fault. The readjustment in their lives had to be accomplished through a foreign language. This is the actual church where they used to worship while they were in Amsterdam. After about a year, they appealed to the city of Leiden, about 35 miles south, for permission to live in that city. Permission granted, they relocated in Leiden for the next 11 years and were exemplary in character. They grew to about 300. This is the same church where they used to worship while they were in Leiden. The pastor became an honorable member of the university. Their products were used by other tradesmen, and they were given credit when it was needed. In fact, traveling English tradesmen such as Edward Winslow and Miles Standish cast their lots with them. In the course of time, it became obvious that they had to move once more. There were many factors. It was difficult to make a living in this new market. The children were joining the Netherlands army, and some were submitting to the temptations of the city. Also, because they were a minority, conditions threatened to absorb them into the community, and they were much too patriotic to permit that to happen. Finally, persecution was beginning to reach them. 2 books that the Pilgrims had written had reached England, and James I wanted them brought to justice. All of these conditions related to the destiny of their next move, and several options were discarded in favor of a new home in the colonies. A group of 70 London merchants came up with a proposal which the Pilgrims finally accepted. They had claims to a tract of land obtained from the London Company with a right to self-government. A contingency from England were to join the Leiden group, and they were to cross the Atlantic in 2 vessels, a 60-ton pinnace called the Speedwell and a 180-ton known as the Mayflower. It was from this very canal that the Pilgrims boarded the Speedwell to begin their journey to the new land. They were to rendezvous with the English contingent at Southampton before facing the Atlantic. The journey to the New World began on August the 5th in 1620. There were 30 passengers on the Speedwell and 90 on the Mayflower. After battling contrary winds for 3 days, the Speedwell sprung a leak and had to pull into Dartmouth for repairs. Completely overhauled, they put out to sea the second time.
By this time, the 2 vessels had gone 300 miles on the other side of Land's End, and the Speedwell sprung another serious leak. The both vessels had to turn back to the closest port they could find, which was Plymouth. And by that time, there were 18 passengers on the Speedwell who decided that they didn't want to migrate to the new land. That left 102 passengers, and they decided they would crowd onto the Mayflower and take their chances. Those pilgrims were very familiar with the perils of trying to cross the Atlantic Ocean. There were 180 of them from the Amsterdam Church that migrated to Virginia in March of 1619, but only 50 of them arrived at their destination. Overcrowding and disease took a heavy toll on life. The first part of the journey was uneventful, until gales with a terrific force battered their vessel. One storm followed another. One person died, but a baby was born. This enabled the same number to arrive as had left the port in England. It was after 9 weeks on the open seas that they finally sighted land. It was on November the 9th, and they became somewhat concerned when they found out that it wasn't under the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company. That concern drove them to draw up that familiar and famous Mayflower Compact. There were 41 of the men that signed that contract. They believed that they did it here in this room, the main cabin of Master Christopher Jones. The Mayflower sat off the coast, while 2 separate expeditions set out to find a harbor. Outside of a brief encounter with Indians, they were greatly encouraged with the country, but they were unable to find fresh water or a suitable harbor. It was December the 6th when the 3rd expedition set out. They went out in a little boat similar to the one behind me, known as the Shallop, and they came to land. They found varied cornfields and little brooks, and then they returned to the Mayflower. But there was also good news awaiting them, because the Mayflower, that until that time was positioned out in Cape Cod Bay, was now able to come into the Plymouth Harbor, and 27 days of expedition had finally brought the voyage to a close. You may find it curious, but the Bible that the Pilgrims brought to this new land was not the King James Version. Because of their strong Puritan beliefs, they preferred the Geneva edition. It was from the words of this Bible that they got their resolve and their strength. The greatest adversity that they were ever going to face lay directly ahead of them. The Bible was their only sure foundation in their great time of need. It was December 28th when they finally decided on an exact location for the settlement. They immediately started building barricades. A street was plotted parallel to a stream. The avenue leading from the rock had been named Leyden Street. Because of the severity of the winter, the delays caused by the speedwell, and the fierceness of the storms they faced on the Atlantic when they were coming across the water, they came here totally unprepared for what lay ahead of them. The months of January and February were particularly heavy. It's said that by the end of February, 31 of them had died, mostly women. When they died, they waited until nightfall. Then they took their bodies here to Coves Hill, overlooking Plymouth Harbor, and they buried them, leveled off the graves, and planted on top of it, particularly concerned about what the Indians would think. Sickness was so severe among them that they had taken the first house they built and converted it into a hospital, and they still faced problems because there were more people that were sick than were well able to tend to their needs. It's reported that by the end of January, 1/2 of the pilgrims died and were buried here at Coles Hill. By the middle of March, the warm sun indicated their first severe winter was past. The Indians were greatly feared, and Miles Standish organized a militia and situated 5 cannons on Fort Hill platform. Then one morning, near the end of March, another startling event occurred. They were about to hold a meeting in their common house when an Indian came walking down the middle of the road and he greeted them with a hearty welcome in English. He was going to go into the house when they stopped him until they found out more about him. They found out that his name was Samson, and he yielded to them a wealth of information.
The following Thursday, he introduced them to Squanto. Squanto was fluent in English. He was one of 24 natives who had been kidnapped and sold as slaves in Spain. He had escaped to England and eventually returned to the area only to discover that he was the sole survivor of his tribe. Squanto, in turn, introduced the pilgrims to another native leader by the name of Massasoit, who brought 60 of his men with him. The result was that a peace pact was organized between them that lasted for the next 50 years. On April 5th, 1621, the Mayflower hoisted her sails and set out once more for the open seas. This was the last link that bound the pilgrims to England, and they watched its upper sails disappear into the horizon of water.
These brave and courageous pilgrims in the government of circumstance became the seeds of a new nation. It must be remembered they were humans made of flesh and blood like we are. They sacrificed fortunes, they suffered privations, they endured hardships, but for one supreme purpose. They wanted the freedom to worship God according to the dictates of their own conscience. And it must be remembered, they prized that liberty above life itself, and all the obstacles that were placed in their way to prevent the accomplishment, they overcame. While we pay tribute to these great men, the forefathers of this nation, we ought to pause for a moment and pay tribute to the source of their strength, the place where they found comfort in sorrow, to the magnet that drew them across 3,000 miles of churning, tempestuous, cold Atlantic waters beyond the edge of civilization. The source of that strength was a book, the Bible. They held it supreme in all matters of faith and practice. And that Bible we know as the indestructible book.